Hi, welcome back to month 2 of the Magical Garden Quilt-Along. Today we're going to be using our Petite Leaves Galore template to cut out the shapes for blocks 3 and 4 for our quilt. These blocks use some different shapes. We're going to be cutting S-shaped curves. We're also going to be modifying some of our leaves so that we can make additional shapes using that basic leaf as our foundation. We're also going to learn to cut 2 different shapes for our vines. So follow along with our step-by-step video as well as the printed pattern. The PDF pattern is available to you now on the website, and so I've printed out that pattern. I've punched 3 holes so that I can add it to my book. So now I have my color chart right next to my cutting instructions. So I have cut all 4 piles of fabric, one for my 2.5-inch leaves, another pile for my vines. We have a separate pile for a different set of vines. So these are the vines for block 4 and these are the vines for block 3. And then we have our S and Z shaped curved pieces of fabric that we're going to cut those shapes from. So all 4 of those piles are ready to go. Let me show you how to cut your S and your Z shaped curves as well as your vines. We're going to cut those shapes first. And the reason why we're cutting those shapes first is so that we can use the leftover fabric, the scrap fabric, to cut all of our small 2.5-inch leaves from the scrap. That way we may not even have to use all this fabric in this pile, and we can reserve that for future use. We also use 3-inch leaves in these blocks. When you use the 3-inch leaves for this block, you're going to be able to retrieve those from those leaves that you already cut last month. If you didn't cut all the 3-inch leaves for the entire quilt, you'll need to cut some more for these blocks. But you can refer to the video for cutting 3-inch leaves. I won't go over that step again because you already know from last month how to cut the 3-inch leaves. So let's get started. When we're cutting block 3 vines, we're going to stack colors 4 and 5, and we're going to cut our vines the standard way, just like we did the last time. So what we're going to do is place the tool at the bottom edge of our fabric. So we're going to get this nice S-shaped curve when we cut our vines. So let's go get started here. Remember, we're cutting very, very slowly, just like in machine quilting. You're going to gain muscle memory for these curves, and the more you cut them, the more natural it's going to feel. Now, when you're doing machine quilting, the more you quilt a particular shape, the easier it gets. And that's the same exact thing with cutting. So I'm just sliding my tool over by 3/8 of an inch every time. And I'm using this straight line on the tool in order to move that tool over by 3/8 of an inch. Now you'll notice that there's extra fabric here. When we have this extra fabric, we're going to go back and cut that with our 2.5-inch leaf template, the other side of the Petite template, to get 2.5-inch leaves out of this section of fabric and over here out of this section of fabric. So I've cut 2 sets of leaves out of the 2 fabrics. I still have this space over here. I know that I can fit in another leaf right here. So let's cut this last leaf out of the scrap. Then we can actually get rid of all this scrap fabric. I'm lining up the dash line of the tool with the line that I've just cut. And that's how I can cut individual leaves as well. So let's remove some of this scrap here so you can see what we've done. We've cut our 3 sections of vine. Then we have this extra fabric over here and over here to continue cutting 2.5-inch leaves. When we're doing the camel hump vines, we need to find the center of our vine material. So our fabric is 12.5 inches wide, so I'm going to mark that right at the 6 1/4 line. And I'm going to do both of those. And the reason why we are marking that center line is so we can center our tool on that centering line. I'm using the A on my template that's in the very center of the Petite tool. Then I'm going to be cutting from edge to edge on my fabric. What I do like to do, however, is to make sure that there's a straight line here right on the edge of my fabric, and then this edge is still on the fabric from edge to edge. So let's cut first to get that nice camel hump shape to our vine. We're cutting very slowly. Once again, we have leftover fabric. That's going to be used for our 2.5 inch leaves. Now I'm going to slide that tool over by 3/8 of an inch. And I can use the line on this edge. These are 1/4 inch markings here. So at first it was here, I went over by 1 full marking, and now I'm going halfway between the next 2. I'm still checking to make sure my A is on that centering line. So that looks like a good 3/8 of an inch, and I'm going to cut that one vine. You only need one of these camel humps from each color of fabric, and the rest of the fabric is going to be used once again to cut our 2.5 inch leaves. So I'm going to pull this apart. I'm going to stack one on top of the other because I know I like to cut my 2.5 inch leaves 4 at a time, or you can simply do it 2 at a time. So here's our next piece. We need 4 vines, and I was only making 2 at a time. So let me just demonstrate that one more time. Centering line, the A, goes on the chalk line. I'm using a line on my template along the raw edges of the fabric, and I'm going to make my first cut just like this. Slide that away. Now I'm going to move over by 3/8 of an inch. Once again, we started here, here's a 1/4, and halfway across that next 1/4 is the 1/8 of an inch that we need to make 3/8. And now we're going to cut again. We end up having exactly the same amount of waste, and we're going to use that waste to cut our 2.5 inch leaves. Whenever we have waste in the next set of lemon-shaped leaves that we're going to cut, then we're going to use all of those wasted pieces to cut 2.5 inch leaves, and that way we can find out how many 2.5 inch leaves we have from the scraps before we cut into the fabric that we have set aside for our 2.5 inch leaves. Okay, I want to show you how small of a piece of fabric you can use to make a 2.5 inch leaf. I've got this tiny little scrap here, and I want to show you how you know if you can get a 2.5 inch leaf out of there. Your 2.5 inch leaf is this one outlined with the dash line right here. It's the biggest dash line. You're always using the biggest dash line on your tool. If you can move this tool around and that dash line is all on fabric and this cutting edge is all on fabric, you know you can get a 2.5 inch leaf out of that piece of fabric. So what I do first is I cut using that nice curved edge. Then what I'm going to do is just spin this around, keeping it all lined up. And then I'm going to find that dash line. The dash line is going to go right on the cut line. And now I can cut the other side. So if you are cutting leaves one at a time, that's a simple way to do it. So now that I've cut all of my scrap pieces over here, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 2.5 inch leaves before I even cut any more of my fabric. This is just from the waste from cutting my vines. When I look over on my chart, I find that from those two colors, for the entire quilt, I only need about 20 leaves. So I am most of the way there already, and I will get the rest of those leaves out of my scrap from the S and the Z-shaped curves. So that is one way to save fabric, is to use all of your scraps before you cut the fabric that you've assigned for those shapes. Now, because we've already assigned some fabric for those shapes, if your scraps are too small or if you make mistakes when you're cutting, you have plenty of fabric assigned for those colors and for those shapes. So don't worry if you don't get this big assortment of leftover pieces from your scraps. Our next shape that we're cutting are our S and our Z-shaped curves from our fabrics. And there's a whole lot of S and Z-shaped curves in block 4, but while we're cutting S and Z-shaped curves, we're going to cut them out for our entire quilt. If you have a small piece of fabric, you're going to leave that fabric out flat. There's only one piece that's really large. From fabric 9, we have a 12-inch piece of fabric. That one we're going to cut folded, and I'll show you why in just a moment. When we are cutting our S-shaped curves, we're going to put the fusible side of our fabric down on our cutting mat, and we're going to layer 2 layers at a time. When you have a nice sharp blade, you can do this more than 2 layers at a time. You can do 3 or 4 layers at a time. But I'm going to show you with 2 layers, and I think that's a good way for you to practice. We're going to start cutting our curve using the 13-inch measurement on the top of our tool right here. And we're going to start our cut from the bottom and work our way up very, very slowly around these 2.5-inch curves. Once again, the 2.5-inch curve is the tightest curve on all 3 of my tools. So it is the hardest one to cut. So I'm going to have you cut that piece off, and then we're going to cut our S curves by going down and to the left at the same time. So I'm keeping these 2 edges in contact with each other. Now, in order to move this tool, I do need to lift up the edge because of the Grace True Grips on the bottom. Whenever I move my tool, I lift up the edge and I pull it down. If you try to pull it down and to the left, you've got those Grace True Grips on and it's going to pull your fabric down with it. So let's start again. Move your tool onto your fabric exactly the way you made your first cut. That's always the place to start with an S-shaped curve. So where you first cut, then lift up the edge of your tool and go down and to the left. Do you see those pretty S shapes starting to happen? I'm going to move down until the letter E on my template is at the very top of my fabric. There is a small letter E right here. Then we have another small letter E here and another small letter E here. What I like to say is that this letter E is between these 2 S shapes, and the line ending in E ends right at the edge of the fabric that we've already cut. This allows you to cut individual S-shaped curves. You're not cutting a long curvy piece of fabric. You're cutting individual S shapes, and where your tool came together with the edge of your fabric, that's where they get cut apart. Now, even though this is not a complete S shape, we're going to cut from the bottom to the top of our fabric every single time. That way we see this clean serpentine edge, and we're ready to move down and to the left again to make additional S-shaped curves. But I do want to look at my chart first, because if we only need 2 S-shaped curves for this color, then we wouldn't want to cut more because we'll need that fabric for our Z-shaped curves. So let me check my chart first before I cut these two S shapes. But assuming I'm going to cut more S shapes, I want to show you how you know that this S shape and this new S shape are going to be the same size. What I like to do is take one of my fabrics that I've already cut and lay it right down on top of the fabric I'm about to cut. You're going to see if that fits in perfectly. If it does, you're ready to cut. Just remove that place before cutting. If this piece does not fit in perfectly, you're going to adjust your tool either up or down by just a smidge until this fits perfectly. You'll also notice when you go to cut that right here where the two edges come together is a letter E. There's a letter E right here, and there's another E right here. So I know when I cut this shape, they'll be the exact same size S's that I cut before. I'm glad I checked my chart. Colors 6 and 7 are the two colors that I'm cutting right now. From colors 6 and 7, I need two S-shaped curves, which I already have cut, and I need two Z-shaped curves. So here are my two S's. Those are done. Now I'm going to start cutting Z-shaped curves. So from the exact same fabric, you already have a serpentine line cut. You're going to flip your fabric over so it now has the fusible on the top. Then we're going to lay our template right over the line that you have just cut. And I'm going to just inspect that and make sure it's nice and clean. I see a little bit here that's messy. I'm going to clean up that edge so I know I have a clean cut from edge to edge. Now that looks perfect. Now that I have a nice clean serpentine line, I'm going to pull down and to the left again. So I lift up the edge of my tool, pull down and to the left. Once again, I'm looking for that letter E. If I place the letter E between these two shapes and between these two shapes, I do that by eye to start. But now I want to go back and take an S shape that I've already cut and place it right over that shape I'm about to cut. And I'm going to adjust my tool up just a hair so that these two become the exact same size. Now I know that it looks like we're cutting S shapes again right now, and we are, but remember we turned our fabric over. So with the fusible on top, we proceed the exact same way we did before to cut S shapes. But now, once you have them cut, you need to flip them over before you fuse. So now you can see we have matching S and Z-shaped curves. Now down here, my template wasn't quite close enough to the cut edge, so these two look like they're still connected, but it's just by a thread. I'm going to just cut that thread so that I can have perfect little Z-shaped curves that match my S-shaped curves. Now do you see what we have over here? Here's another opportunity to use your leftover fused fabric after cutting your two S-shape and your two Z-shaped curves from this fabric. We're going to use that leftover fabric and cut more 2.5-inch leaves. So there are some, there's a nice hump right here. We know if we slide our tool up or down right here, we're going to get more of our 2.5-inch leaves. So the reason why we can cut 2.5-inch leaves from the same fabric we cut the S and the Z-shaped curves is because we're always using the same size template. When we use the 2.5-inch template to cut our S and Z-shaped curves, all those leftover pieces, because they're cut with the 2.5-inch template, makes the perfect space to get more 2.5-inch leaves cut. So you can see why I want you to cut up all of your scraps of fabric before moving forward and looking at the chart for 2.5-inch leaves. because more than likely we're going to have all those 2.5-inch leaves already cut, enough for our entire quilt, or at least pretty close, so you don't have to spend more time cutting 2.5-inch leaves later. That looks great to me. I'm going to just do one more thing. This little tiny piece, it's not a full 2.5-inch leaf, but I hate to waste even that little bit. When I make some of my flowers, these little tips right here, if they're going behind 2 other leaves, they're certainly big enough to go as one level or one layer of my flower. So I don't even waste these little end pieces that are only a partial leaf. Keep all of those. I keep those in a separate bag, and I know that when I need partial leaves, I already have some of those cut. This large piece of fabric, we need quite a few S and Z curves from this color, which is color number 9. I'm going to take that large piece of fabric and I'm going to place half of it fusible side down. Then I'm going to fold my fabric so half of that fabric is fusible side up. So when I cut my S-shaped curves, I'm actually making the mirror image because I've put these fabrics face to face. So let me give you a demonstration on what I mean exactly by making mirror images all at the same time. The Z curve is just the mirror image of the S curve. The Z curve is cut when you have your fusible side up, and the S curve is made when you have your fabric fusible side down, but it's the exact same cut. From here, we're going to slide our template down. Do you see I started with the number 13 at the very top edge of my fabric? The reason why I start with the number 13 on the very top edge is I end up with a full S-shaped curve right here. The very first thing I do is cut a full S-shaped curve. Rather than just randomly placing your tool, this helps you to utilize your fabric in the best way possible. So we have an S-shaped curve here and another S-shaped curve here. I'm sliding down until I see the letter E is halfway between these two shapes. Now I'll also have the letter E right here at the top of my fabric, just with this first cut. So I'm going to cut from the bottom edge, hugging the edge of that tool, going very slowly along the 2.5-inch curve. And here we go. Here is our S and our Z shape in one step. So that's a nice tip when you have to have S and Z shapes that match each other perfectly. For example, the two sides of a tulip. This is a wonderful way to make those S and Z shapes very quickly and easily by putting your fabrics right sides together. Slide down into the left again, and you can continue making more S-shaped curves. Now, if you don't want a big fat S-shaped curve like this one, and we do want those for today's project, and in fact for the entire quilt, but say you have another project in mind and you want to make a very thin S-shaped curve, you can do that as well. So you make that curve as wide as you want it to be by pulling the tool down and to the left at the same time. I'm using just about the thickest S-shaped curve I would ever use. It's nice and fat, nice and chunky, and I'm going to make sure that they're the same size that I cut before by using one that I've already cut as my sample or as my guide, as my template, so that I know every single S shape is perfect. So here are 2 more S's and Z's. Now you'll notice that I've cut almost to the edge of my fabric, but I've run out of tool. I actually moved that tool up by 1 full leaf shape so that I can complete that cut. This little bit hanging out the end is going to make it look awfully strange the next time you cut. You always want to see one serpentine line down the edge of your fabric all the way down. So if you do run out of template to cut, move your template to complete the serpentine line. Now that I've moved my template up, when I pull down into the left, I'll be able to get more S-shaped curves. For the entire quilt, I need 9 S's and 5 Z shapes. So I already have enough Z shapes. Let's count those out. I have this one and this one. Do you see when I take these apart, I end up with 1 S shape and 1 Z shape. So let's see, I know that I have at least 5. In fact, I have 6 already. So I'm going to stop cutting the Z shapes. That means I'm going to unfold my fabric. So the next cut is only going to be S shapes. Why continue to cut Z shapes if we're not going to use them in the quilt? We can save fabric by cutting the last 3 S's that we need just from the fabric that is fusible side down. And there are the 3 more that I need. So we did give you some extra fabric on fabric 9. S and Z shapes can be a little challenging when you're first learning to use my tools. So I want you to practice, and you have enough fabric so that if you do make some mistakes, you're not going to run out of fabric. There's plenty of fabric here to cut your 9 S-shaped curves and your Z curves. But count them out as you go. You don't want to cut too many. You'd rather have this fabric left over to continue cutting your 2.5-inch leaves from. Now we have some partial S shapes and Z shapes here. In this block number 4, we can sometimes use partial S shapes and Z shapes. We do not always need complete shapes. But you'll notice that we can also cut 2.5-inch leaves from those shapes. So you don't want to waste those pieces, and you don't want to throw those pieces away. Go ahead and cut your 2.5-inch leaves from these pieces, and then from these leftover bits as well. So you're well on your way getting all of the 2.5-inch leaves you need for this quilt cut while you're doing your S's and your Z curves. Once again, we're using our fabric and our time in the best possible way. So we're not wasting fabric, we're not wasting our time. And you'll have the shapes for this block cut in no time at all. Remember that this month we did our cutting ahead of time for the S and Z curves. These are all the color 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 S and Z curves. I'm not going to be using those curves in blocks 3 and 4. Those I'm going to reserve for next month's blocks. We did want to get them all cut ahead of time. That way we got to use the leftovers in order to make our 2.5-inch leaves. So thanks for bearing with me. I know there was a lot of cutting this month, but doesn't it feel good to have it all done? And now we're a step ahead for all our other blocks. Every month we have some of our shapes pre-cut.